This podcast was produced by OAR FM Dunedin with support from New Zealand On the Air.
The Science Notes podcast on OAR FM Dunedin, brought to you by the Division of Sciences at the University of Otago. I'm Dave McMorrin. Over the next half hour, I'll be chatting with a graduate science student about their research, their passion for science, and the things that fuel their creativity. Well, hello there, and welcome to Science Notes again for another time. My name's Dave McMorrin, and today our guest is Connal McLean. Hi, Connal.
Kia ora, thanks for having me.
Connal is doing a PhD in zoology at the University of Otago, and he is all about bees. So we're going to be talking a bit today about bees.
All things bees, that's me.
Always room for a good bee. Before we get into that, though, how is it that you find yourself doing a PhD?
Yeah, no, I'm from Tamaki Makaurau originally, but as the accent may hint at, I grew up overseas, so I left Aotearoa when I was about 6 or 7.
Right.
Moved around the UK and the US.
Yep.
So the accent's a bit of a mutt. But I ended up coming back in 2020 around the height of the pandemic, or the start,
well done.
I suppose.
Yes.
I did my undergraduate at the University of California at Davis in biological psychology. So that was my main focus.
Biological psych.
Yeah. So
no, you're going to have to explain
behavior.
that.
Yeah. So it's I guess similar to neuroscience a little bit, but less chemistry, more biology focused.
There's always room for less chemistry.
Always, yeah. So it's focus on how the brain impacts behavior, stuff like that. And then while I was finishing up there, literally in my last year, I realized that Davis has a world-renowned entomology program, which I had no idea about. It was originally an ag school, so they're very focused on veterinary production, agriculture, stuff like that. But also have this outstanding entomology program. So I started getting into that and discovered, hey, this is really cool. These are my animals. I'd always been kind of interested in animal behavior. But up until I found out about the entomological program, I was basically set to go into clinical psychology.
Right.
So quite a pivot there. But then once I finished up my undergrad in 2019, luckily before kind of stuff hit the fan. So once I finished that up, I came over and did an apiculture course with the Polytech.
Okay.
So that's working with honeybees, their keeping and management, all that fun stuff. And I thought, this is really cool, but I really want to know more what's going on behind the scenes, under the cover, so to speak. So I reached out to a researcher, Dr. Jenny Yunt, in the zoology department, and she's otherwise known as the wasp lady. So anything social insects, she's your gal, and just a whiz with anything bees. So I started working with her on a project looking at the pollination in different environments that had different floral complexities. So looking at tomato crop pollination and the effect of having other flowering species within that area. So from that, we found that having so-called companion plantings of lavender and borage increased the fruit set of the tomatoes. So that was with bumblebees, which was a good setup into my master's, where I used the same design that she had. We've got out at Invermay 2 huge glass houses that are each subdivided into 4 what we call caves. And in each of those caves, we placed a bumblebee colony. And so that was how we got the results from her stuff. But then for my master's, I looked at associative learning and associative flexibility. So learning and memory, essentially, in bumblebees.
So there's your psychology stuff coming back.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So we were looking at the effect of the diversity of the floral environment, either having 2 flowering species or 26 flowering species. And then we did these really fun little cognitive tests on the bees. So that was just completely out of this world for me, coming from a very human-oriented psychology background. And yeah, so I finished that up in 2023 and then worked for a while at Te Papa up in Wellington, as well as Tahura as a science communicator. And while keeping the passion for insects and bugs alive, I really touched back to my science communication roots. That was always something I was very passionate about during my undergrad. Community involvement and engagement with the scientific process, as well as scientific outputs. So I've managed to kind of Frankenstein those two passions together, bees and science communication, for the PhD. So I'll be looking at the interactions and coexistence dynamics between introduced and native bees. So a lot of Kiwi don't know, but we do actually have native bees, and honeybees and bumblebees, which are kind of the most charismatic and prolific bees, are actually not native to Aotearoa.
No, they're European.
Yeah, they were introduced for commercial
I know this because
reasons.
I've done this radio show for a while.
Yeah. But yeah, no, for folks listening, you won't be alone in if this is your first time hearing that Aotearoa has native bees. So we've got about 41 bee species, and 28, well over half of those are native.
Yeah.
So yeah, the honeybee and bumblebee, as well as the alfalfa leafcutter bee, some mason bees were brought over for commercial purposes. So we, in the 1900s, brought over a bunch of livestock, cattle, sheep, pigs, but the native bees here don't actually pollinate their food crops, alfalfa, lucerne, clover. So we actually had to bring those over because there were huge die-offs of all these very expensive animals that we just worked to bring over. So in a lot of other parts of the world, there's a huge body of evidence that honeybees, because they're not native, so when they're beyond their native range, they can have really detrimental impacts on native pollinators, especially other bees, which are typically wild. Honeybees and bumblebees are typically managed for crop pollination, agricultural purposes, stuff like that. But having these bees, which can, go feral, they can break captivity essentially, or just when they're so-called doing their job when managed for pollination, they can compete with native bees and other wild pollinators. Looking at how that may translate to our Aotearoa landscapes. Previous work has shown that honeybees actually don't have much competition with native bees in New Zealand, but obviously that's contrary to the rest of the world. So digging a bit more into that and hoping to tweak apart, if there's reasons for that, or is it just that Aotearoa is so beautiful and our
the
flowering
native bees are just that much more bolshy and
they can make do maybe.
So is the issue that the honeybees, the introduced bees, are taking the food that the native bees would eat, or is it just that they're muscling their way into their habitats?
Yeah, a little of both. I'd say a bit more resource competition. So bees forage for pollen, for protein, for colony development, and nectar for carbohydrates, for energy. So pollen and nectar are the main floral resources that they're competing over. But because honeybees and bumblebees are both eusocial and primitively social, respectively, they have these big, dense hives. So it can be... Part of it is just, they have the numbers to more effectively, more efficiently exhaust those floral resources in the landscape. But funnily enough, when you mention muscling their way in, that was still one of my favorite anecdotes from my master's, was seeing bumblebees who were sisters. So all the foragers are female. So two sisters from the same colony in the same habitat. And if one was on, what was clearly, very obviously, a very attractive flower, so it must have awesome pollen, awesome nectar, her sister would come up, grab her while she was foraging, and throw her off the flower. So there was a fair bit of literally muscling their way in. Right. And I haven't seen that exact thing happen with native bees, but I have noticed out in the field so far that a lot of the native bees are more averse to that kind of interaction. They're more skittish. They'll depart before a honeybee or bumblebee even gets close. And it's for a good reason. So the honeybees and bumblebees are much bigger than our native bees. Our native bees are typically less than 5 millimeters long, and that's on the larger side. And they are much smaller than our introduced bees, so some physical competition there, definitely.
So if they're small and they're more dispersed, how do you count? How do you ascertain? How do you go find them? Count how many there, work out that there's less than there should be.
Yep, exactly. Yeah, so it's a lot of if you know, you know. So we typically put out feelers in gardening groups throughout through the university bulletins and stuff. Have you seen these kind of insects? But we've got really well-established populations out at Orokonui Eco Sanctuary. Actually just around the fence, the perimeter fence. So they can keep up that good work. We've also identified populations in the town belt in town and at Swampy Summit.
Right.
Yeah, so and they won't nest in the exact same holes. So they are ground nesting bees as opposed to honeybees, which nest in cavities like trees or houses.
Boxes.
Or boxes. So they won't nest in... The daughter won't nest in the exact same hole that her mother was in, but they won't disperse too far.
Right.
So there's a good chance that those almost perennial aggregations or congregations will persist over years.
Right. And is this auditing of the bees, is this something that's been going on for a long time in the group and in the university? Or
Yeah, for a little bit. Jenny has been the driving force in that, as well as Professor Janice Lord, who's in botany. She's a whiz on all things plants, but is looking at plant-pollinator interactions as well. So she and Associate Professor Sherry Johnson have done a lot of work with native bees and looking at their pollination networks, stuff like that. But compared to, say, some of the marine science or other departments, definitely a relatively young field.
Yeah. So you said earlier that the honeybees were brought and the bumblebees were brought out initially. I mean, I never really thought about this, but it makes sense that somehow they had to ship them out to pollinate the food that they needed for the cattle and the sheep and everything they were bringing out as well. So there's presumably ships coming out full of bees, which must have been a thing. Do the native bees, do we need the native bees to pollinate the native plants?
Yep, 100%.
So the introduced bees won't pollinate.
Yeah,
there's obviously the whole business about the Manuka honey, but up in general, does it need to be the native bees for the native plants? Yeah,
and so it's really good that you bring up Manuka honey because honeybees are actually not efficient pollinators of a lot of crops or a lot of plants in general. I should say a lot of plants, not just crops.
Yes.
And so, honeybees, they're really good at foraging and collecting resources for themselves, but they don't actually translate that into pollination,
That's
which
not
is
their point.
Yeah. So pollination is the transfer of pollen from one flower to another, which generally increases fruit set, seed count, seed weight, stuff like that, which is all great for the plants. But honeybees are a bit sneaky. They don't really care about the plant side of things,
right.
And to a lesser extent similar to bumblebees, they're just collecting to bring back to their babies, to their brood, so any pollination that they do is just a happy byproduct and not the actual intention of the bee.
Is that something they've been bred to do?
In the case of the honeybees, most likely, yep. Yeah, there's definitely selection for honey production as opposed to and obviously honeybees and bumblebees are useful and in some cases even necessary for pollination of certain crops. For instance, Solanaceae, which is tomatoes, eggplants, a bunch of our fruiting nightshade family, are only pollinated by bumblebees. So they do this really cool little thing where they vibrate at the exact frequency that those plants need in order to release the pollen. So that's known as sonication or buzz pollination, which kind of fits for the bumblebee.
Yeah.
But back to your original question. So native bees have evolved for millennia. Hundreds of thousands of years before humans were here, they were evolving with our native Aotearoa ecosystems, our native plants, as well as our other native fauna. So they're really important pollinators for a lot of native plants, pahuihui, manuka, kanuka, pahutakawa, as well as a lot of our lesser-known plants, like a lot of our native mistletoes, are only pollinated by native bees.
So, in fact, there's a case to say that in order for the manuka honey industry to keep going, it's in everyone's interest to keep the native bees around.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. We can get the honey, but we can only get it as long as we've got the trees, right?
Only got the trees, right?
Yeah.
One of the things that you've got in your notes, which I find fascinating, is this idea of using eDNA to try and, so rather than having to see where the bees are, actually cite them, you can detect that they've been by this technique using this thing called eDNA.
It's kind of the best thing since sliced bread in terms of ecological studies. So eDNA essentially uses traces of genetic material that are deposited in the environment, such as in the sediment in the soil, on flowers for the case of pollinators. But as you said, it's finding that there has been the animal there without directly observing or noting the presence of it. So
it's like if it was a person, like little bits of skin that flake off.
Yeah, exactly.
You can look at that and look at the DNA that's in that.
Yeah.
And then work out whether that was from the bee.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and you get just a wealth of other information alongside that. So, you can get not only what bees have been pollinating it, but, what other pollinators are visiting, their general family or order. A lot of our pollinators in Aotearoa are insects. So it'll be a lot of digging through the insect material and eDNA to figure out what we're actually getting there.
And presumably for that to work, someone's had to have gone out and sequenced the DNA of all the different native bees.
Yeah. So we are working on reference libraries with which to compare those signatures.
This is, like we were saying earlier, when I started doing this radio show, all of this was science fiction.
Yeah.
It's very, very new, and it's just exploded.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. Yeah, and it's a very, because you can, take a sample at, say, a couple times over a season, as opposed to previously you'd have to go out literally every day, all day, and visually track the bees. It's a lot less intensive.
Yeah, and
still
you'd
gets
want
those
to pick
answers.
your day if you're going up swampy and stuff.
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
You wouldn't want to be there yesterday, for example.
Yes, exactly.
But I suppose the bees probably would have been quiet in the snow as well. But
yeah. So they our native bees they forage a lot less distance than honeybees or bumblebees. So honeybees will forage up to 10 kilometers from their nest. Bumblebees up to 5 kilometers from their nest. Our native bees, their farthest range is about 200 meters. So almost a tenth of a honeybee's range. But they'll also operate for a much less of the season, so they're only really active from now, November, October-ish, through to February, March. So only in the real heat of the season. They fly only in nice warm temperatures with low wind, so not great for the Dunedin weather that we have. And they're just fundamentally very different in their biology and their behavior than a lot of our introduced bees.
Right. Well, we're starting to run out of time, but I want to talk to you a bit about the outreach stuff that you're doing as well. You said at the start it's a big part of what you do and why you do it. Tell us about what you've been doing with the bees out in schools and in industry as well, which is interesting.
Yeah. So I'll be using the data that I collect in the field as well as historical data from museums. So I've been sampling pollen from museums and pollen from live bees caught in the field, and then using the results from that, seeing if there's competition or niche overlap or partitioning between the introduced and native bees, and use that to generate effective science communication for different groups. So as I mentioned, a lot of Kiwis don't know that we have native bees, so the starting point is pretty basic, and a lot of our preliminary data shows, so this is research that we did with Dr. Jenny Yunt, my master's and supervisor. So we found that a lot of the overwhelming majority of folks are so keen to help the bees, but they actually don't know what a bee is.
Yeah.
So we generated this simple game called Is It a Bee? Sounds really straightforward. You're given 6 pictures of insects found in Aotearoa, and your job is to say yes, no, is it a bee? So the preliminary data that we've gotten from almost 200 participants is that folks don't know what our native bees look like. They can accurately identify bumblebees and honeybees, around 60% as bees. Compare that to our native bees, it's far below chance, far below 50%.
That's because they're not yellow, presumably.
Yep, yeah, so they're a lot smaller. They lack that fur and distinctive black and yellow coloration for a lot of our native bees. And so furthermore on that, we asked, after doing the identification game, we asked folks to give us their top adjective that they associate with each of the 4 insect groups that were represented in the game. So you get 6 insects from either butterflies, bees, wasps, or flies. So those 4 groups. A little bit of a water is wet study. So people really associated bees and butterflies with positive adjectives: pollination, pretty, colorful. Our poor little flies did not get quite that spotlight. They got a lot of poo, disgusting, ew. And the wasps got satanic as one of their, or evil as one of their biggest adjectives. And yeah, so it really highlights that folks want to help bees, but they don't know how to do that, and they don't know what our native bees look like. But if they're also mistaking these native bees for wasps or flies, they're most likely having those negative connotations that they associate with flies and wasps. And on that note, flies and wasps are really important pollinators as well. So there's over 2,000 species of wasps in New Zealand. Pretty much everyone knows about our 5 introduced pest species, the Vespula and Perlistes. But the overwhelming majority of wasps pose no threat whatsoever to humans and are, again, like our bees, like our flies, really important to our native ecosystems.
Yeah. And the work with industry, just very quickly?
Yeah. So I'll, as my main outreach demographic groups, I'll be working with primary and secondary school tamariki and their teachers. So that's kind of, the children subset, aim for the future. But then I'll also be working with honeybee keepers. So a lot of the work I've done, not to throw them under the bus, but with a lot of the beekeeping groups around the Otago region, the similar story tracks. They want to help bees, but they don't actually know what bees are. As honeybee keepers, they really are that front line of the interaction between introduced and native bees beyond the research space. So I'd really like to get some legislation out of it, even much further down the road. But our current legislation doesn't even address insects as animals. So in terms of research ethics in New Zealand, insects don't count as animals. And our legislation reflects that. So a lot of our legislation focuses on our big vertebrates, our lovely birds, or our natural spaces, which is great. But we need those protections as well for our little critters, for our bees, as well as flies, moths, everything.
I mean, because the honey industry is not insignificant in New Zealand.
No. So the honey gets about $5 billion New Zealand dollars a year.
You'd want to have legislation to try and make it sustainable.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the big takeaways that I try to get home at my talks is we're not trying to completely eliminate the honeybee industry, but we do want to make sure we're responsibly stewarding the native bee and wild bee populations, as well as getting our profits from the honey industry and from crop pollination. So just finding that balance. Yeah.
Cool. Well, that's our time. Thank you, Connal.
Thank you.
All the best for the rest of the PhD and for whatever's next.
Kia ora.
And thank you everyone out there for listening. We'll see you next time. You've been listening to the Science Notes podcast, brought to you by the Division of Sciences at the University of Otago. To listen again or to find other episodes in this series, go to Otago Access Radio's website, oar.org.nz, or to your favourite podcast platform.
This podcast was produced by OAR FM Dunedin with support from New Zealand On the Air.